We will once again do our scripture lesson as a dramatic reading this morning. This comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 22, verse 66 through chapter 23, verse 25. When day came, the assembly of the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, gathered together, and they brought him to their council. They said, "If you are the Messiah, tell us." He replied,
"If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I question you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God."
All of them asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He said to them,
"You say that I am."
Then they said,
"What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips."
Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying,
"We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king."
Then Pilate asked him.
"Are you the king of the Jews?"
He answered.
"You say so."
Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds,
"I find no basis for an accusation against this man."
but they were insistent and said,
"He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee where he began, even to this place."
When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some sign. He questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then he put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That same day Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them,
"You brought me this man as one who's been perverting the people. And here I have examined him in your presence and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him."
Then they all shouted out together,
"Away with this fellow, release Barabbas for us."
This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting.
"Crucify, crucify him."
A third time he said to them,
"Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him."
But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they wished.
Thank you for sharing our scripture. What a wonderful way to hear it in new voices. What has brought us to this moment? What events have occurred to create such an incredible miscarriage of justice? To answer this question, I want to look at the two main characters involved, Caiaphas and Pilate. First, I would like for us to center in on the person of Caiaphas. We'll have no difficulty establishing his guilt. If any one man can be singled out as being responsible for crucifying Jesus, it is Caiaphas. Caiaphas, the high priest of the temple of Jerusalem. He was that, and in our terms, we could equal him to the Pope or to someone like our own bishop. It was he who instigated the arrest of Jesus, he who paid Judas the 30 pieces of silver, he who presided over the kangaroo court, he who presented the charges to Pilate, and he of who Jesus said to Pilate, "The deeper guilt lies with the man who handed me over to you." In short, Caiaphas was the brain behind Calvary. All the others were simply pawns in his hands. He conceived, plotted, and engineered the whole plan to kill Jesus. He was the real villain of the Good Friday episode, made even worse, knowing he was a religious leader, a holy man. As he is marched into our mock trial, we try to take a good look at this man who held the highest and most holy office in Israel. He seems impressive in his priestly robe, though it does not hide the smugness on his face or the cunning in his eyes or the malice in his heart. As high priest, he exercised spiritual power. In the eyes of the people, he held in his hands the keys to heaven. He alone could enter the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Jerusalem. Caiaphas was economically and politically powerful too. He had some 20,000 priests throughout the nation working for him, and each one of them picked up their wages weekly. Where did this money come from? Not from the voluntary offerings of the faithful. No, indeed, the money came from a special temple tax. Every Jew, in addition to paying taxes to the Roman government, had to pay taxes to the temple in Jerusalem. Caiaphas received his office by appointment, not like I do from my bishop, but by Rome, by the state. Caiaphas held the office for 11 years, and he has succeeded his father-in-law Annas. As an appointee of Rome, he was also a stool pigeon of Rome. He was a pipeline of information to the emperor's ear. This is not a man to be trifled with. When Caiaphas speaks, heads roll, even the heads of dictators. Caiaphas was the real power in Palestine, and Pilate hated him with a passion, but more to the point, he feared him. And so, a man who enjoys that much power is not likely to tolerate someone who threatens it, even though that man is a good citizen and a good man. His conflict with Jesus was almost inevitable. We are told that everywhere Jesus journeyed, there were large crowds, and we can be sure that the spies of Caiaphas were in those crowds. In my opinion, there was one particular development that began to ring an alarm bell in Caiaphas' demented mind. It was the occasion when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. I believe this is the turning point in Jesus' ministry. Converting prostitutes and healing cripples was one thing, Nobody really cared about them. But raising a man from the dead, I'm sure the word got back to Caiaphas. If Jesus has the power to raise a man from the dead, then he also has the power to raise a revolution. He must be illuminated. What about the rest of the Sanhedrin? To be sure, there were those who objected. The Bible is clear on that, but their voice was either too timid or too few. The majority said, if we do nothing and leave this man alone, then the whole nation will believe in him. And the Romans will come in and take away our temple. They'll take away our nation. Caiaphas seized on their thoughts. It is more fitting that one man dies than the whole nation. We have to assume that Caiaphas did care for the nation, but we must also assume that he cared for his own prestige even more. And there you have it. Wrapped in the words of care and concern for the nation is a murderous self-interest. However we judge the other people responsible for Jesus' death, we have no reasonable doubt that the high priest, Caiaphas, stands guilty as charged. But guilty of what? What was his real sin? Some say that he was guilty of expediency. The dictionary defines expediency as the subordination of moral principles for the sake of attaining the desired goal. A definition that would fit Caiaphas like a glove. But the real sin of Caiaphas was the sin of self-interest. I would submit to you this morning that it has always been the sin of self-interest that crucified Christ. Why is it that Herod wanted to kill the Christ child when he was born? It was self-interest. It was at his birth, and it was at his death. The self-interest of powerful people. And don't think that Caiaphas' mentality isn't alive and well today. You see it on the TV just like me. In politics, it's alive. In business, in labor relations, in marriages, between brothers and sisters, and even in the church. Throughout the ages, it is what keeps Christ on the cross. Self-interest. It would be so easy to dismiss Caiaphas as an historical figure who's nothing more than a footnote in the Lenten story, except for the fact that we are all so much like him. Caiaphas is every person, every nation, every government, every institution, every church who will crucify Christ for its own self-interest. Anytime we choose position over purpose, we are committing the sin of Caiaphas. Anytime we choose safety over salvation, we are committing the sin of Caiaphas. At any time we concentrate on what we are doing to the exclusion of what we are being, we are committing the sin of Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the high priest in name only. A priest is a mediator. He or she is one who represents God to humankind and humankind to God. Caiaphas was not that. He was the high priest in name only. Now we turn to Pontius Pilate, the second person who bears responsibility. Many years ago, in 1974, a civil court in France was asked to fix the blame of the crucifixion of Jesus on Pontius Pilate, and thereby absolving the Jewish people of their collective guilt. The plaintiff was a lawyer by the name of Jacques I. Zorny, who in 1976 published a book entitled The Trial of Jesus, which maintained that Jesus was condemned under Roman law as an alleged threat to the government, and not because of his claim to be the Son of God. Friends, the church has been blaming Pilate for the crucifixion of Jesus for 2,000 years. Every time a Christian congregation stands up and recites the Apostles' Creed, it singles out Pilate as the true villain of Good Friday. I believe in Jesus Christ, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate. Why Pilate? Why did we single him out? To be sure, he was the one who legally sentenced Jesus to death, but did he have any real choice in the matter? Before we answer that question, let's just briefly look at the man Pilate. We know that he was about the same age as Jesus. Pilate didn't very much like his appointment as governor of Judea. He knew that it was one of the most difficult places to govern. Must have thought that if he did a good job, avoid making errors, he could be assured of a good future in the foreign service of Rome. From the beginning, most everything went wrong for Pilate. Everything he tried didn't turn out well. Caiaphas, the high priest, retaliated in some of the things that he tried, ordering 2,000 praying Jews to surround Pilate's temple for 6 days and 6 nights. Pilate threatened to massacre them, and they simply stuck their necks out and said, try. He was humiliated. He ordered the images and the temple that he had put up to rile them up. He had them taken down. He tried many other things to win some authority, some ground, but nothing worked. On Thursday of Passover week, Caiaphas confronts Pilate in Jerusalem. Usually Pilate resided in Caesarea, but he was always in Jerusalem during the Passover, the holiday. And he brought to him what we heard moments ago. Pilate tried to wash his hands of it in many ways. He tried to send him to Herod. He tried to get the people themselves to take the blame and to do what they wanted to do, to hear their claims and their charges. Pilate may be way over his head with Caiaphas, but he wasn't stupid. He thinks he has found an escape clause here or there. Then he thinks after Herod there must still be one way out. There is an old custom about releasing one prisoner. He thinks maybe they'll release Jesus instead of Barabbas, but that didn't even work. The crowd shouts, "Give us Barabbas." Now, what was the actual sin of Pilate? He was not just. He could have stood for what was right, but he caved and justice was not served. He took the attitude, this situation is out of my hands, and there is just nothing that I can do about it. Wrong, Pilate. Wrong. There was only one person that day that could have done something about an innocent man wrongly accused, and that was Pilate. It was he who presided as judge and vacated his post. I would submit to you that Pilate mentally is still alive and well today. We look at the issue of world hunger and we think it's out of our hands. There's nothing that I can do about it. We look at the whole issue of war and peace and we think, it's out of my hands. It's too big for me to do anything. There's nothing that I can do about it. So we think, if it's out of our hands, we will do as Pilate did. We will wash our hands of it completely. Perhaps in the end, Pilate's real problem was that he was living his life in fear. And when you live in fear, you are not living at all. The scripture records of the words of Caiaphas to Pilate, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar." When Pilate heard this, the scripture tells us he was all the more afraid. And afraid, what was he afraid of? He was afraid of making a mistake. He was so afraid of making a mistake that he became paralyzed and immobilized. If this is the case, then the real lesson to be learned from Pilate is that if we live a life in fear, we cannot live a life to the fullest. We must act and not simply react. Pilate did not want to assume responsibility, and he let an innocent man die. He attempted to get Caiaphas to make the decision on Jesus, then Herod, then the crowd, and we are even told he went to his wife for her advice. The great irony is that in not wanting to get involved, he forever became involved. In not wanting to make a mistake, he made the biggest mistake of his life. In wanting to disassociate his name with Jesus, he forever associated his name with Jesus. In wanting to wash his hands of blame, he forever will be stained with the blood of the innocent. And that is the paradox of this man's life. I believe in Jesus Christ, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, come.